British Columbia Institute of Technology acknowledges that our campuses are located on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish nations of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh.
Good morning and welcome to BCIT News. I'm Riley Cunningham and here are your news headlines to 10:30. The Vancouver Symphony Orchestra won't be using confidentiality agreements in future cases involving sexual misconduct. VSO President Angela Elster and the orchestra's board signed an open letter saying they acknowledge and regret the suffering endured by violinist Esther Huang, who alleges she was sexually harassed and later assaulted by her former violin instructor. The VSO says they were prompted to reflect and look inward after Huang's story was published in the Globe and Mail last month. The organization sent Huang a cease and desist letter after the story was published for breaking the confidentiality agreement. They now say they won't be taking legal action against her. Huang has said that while she remains disappointed in the VSO, she's immensely grateful to the public for its pushback. The London Drugs in Vancouver's iconic Woodward building will be closing as of February 1st. The retail giant claims a careful assessment of safety and operational conditions led to the decision to shutter the location. President Clint Malman says the store faced persistent safety incidents and significant operating losses, and keeping it open is not sustainable. The company says they will offer employees opportunities to transfer to nearby stores, and they will assist patients with prescription transfers. Vancouver Mayor Ken Sim posted to social media saying it's extremely disappointing to see London Drugs leave the Woodwards building. Sim continued, saying the location closing was a real loss for Gastown and local workers, and that the city continues to invest in public safety, including full funding for different task forces to address crime. Legislation that opens the door to major changes at Toronto's Ontario Place is being constitutionally challenged in an appeal by a coalition in the Supreme Court of Canada. Jim Bronskill with the Canadian Press has more.
The urban park on the Toronto waterfront, opened in 1971, included a cinesphere that showed movies on a huge screen, children's play areas, and several pavilions suspended above the water. The Ontario government plans to redevelop Ontario Place to include an elaborate spa operated by a private company. The coalition Ontario Place Protectors challenged the provincial Rebuilding Ontario Place Act on the basis that it insulates state action from scrutiny by the courts and therefore violates the Constitution. Jim Bronskill, The Canadian Press, Ottawa.
Figures from aviation data firm Cirium show that fewer Canadian flights have been headed to the United States in the last year. Canada-U.S. flight volumes fell more than 14% among Canada's 5 largest carriers, with some of the biggest decreases in Florida and California. John Graddick says there are no signs of a return to business as usual.
The airlines were hoping that this was just going to be a kind of a flash in the pan, this cutback, that it would eventually settle back into a return to sun destinations, and such was not the case. And the first quarter doesn't look much brighter.
The decrease in visits, triggered by U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff war and comments about making Canada the 51st state, means Canadian airlines will now have to compete in more crowded fields overseas and domestically. Harsh Kumar Patel, one of 2 men convicted in a human smuggling operation along the border, will represent himself in U.S. court. Patel was sentenced to just over a decade in prison last week in Minnesota after a jury found him guilty of being part of a ring that brought people from India with a promise of a better life in the U.S., then dropping them off near the border in Canada and telling them to walk across. The criminal ring came to light after an Indian family died of exposure in January 2022 while trying to walk across the border into Minnesota in blizzard conditions. The Patel family consisted of 39-year-old Jagdish Patel, his 37-year-old wife Vaishali, their 11-year-old daughter Vihangi, and their 3-year-old son Dharmik. They were found just 12 meters from the border. Thanks so much for tuning into BCIT News. I'm Riley Cunningham, and we'll see you again at 12:30 for more.
Stay tuned for more on BCIT's 1680 The Crow.
It's your career, your vision, your goal. Navigate it your way. Flexible learning is designed for you. Learn a new skill or earn a degree at your own pace. BCIT, flexible learning for a complex world.